This is Rick the Liberty with Treaty 10 News, and today we have a special guest, former Chief Saul Sanderson with the Federation of Sovereign Indian Nations, has joined us, and he wants to share some thoughts and perspectives on the present day's relationship we have with our crown, with our communities, and our history leading up to where we're at, and some of the hopeful thoughts, I guess, for the future as well, Saul. So you can start however you want. If you want to introduce yourself and the work you've done and how you got here. I know you first got into the FSIN in 1979, is what I looked back. So Kayas.
Yeah, yeah. I was involved in the Indian politics in 1956, 57, going from the Union of Saskatchewan Chiefs to FSI Inc. Back
Wow.
then, I was 15 years old, so I spent over 65 years in Indian politics. Uh, what I want to do, Rick, is first of all say thank you to you for providing this opportunity. Usually I get 20 minutes. I get 5 minutes. I understand we have up to 2 hours. So we'll be able to cover a few things. And what a lot of it'll be, Rick, is what I call the code of silence. Because so much of it is not known by Indians and non-Indians, and by leaders, Indian and non-Indian leaders, and our officials, governments, our own, along with provincial and federal. And it's pretty sad because this type of information that I'm going to provide you has been the basis of our relationship between the Crown and Indian nations and the settlers and our Indian people of North America, not just in Canada. So what I want to do is highlight some of the federal initiatives that are being taken respecting termination, but I also want to cover what our inherent rights are, who we are, who am I, who are you, and inherent rights and treaties, but the bigger framework, the bigger picture that governs Crown Indian nations relations. And I'll highlight those colonial policies of genocide, colonial policies of the Empire and of Canada. So then I'll go into the options we have for implementing everything that is not being moved on today. And I'll show you how we're actually implementing those colonial policies of genocide now. So there has to be a major change in the political representation. What we do now is we tie up our leadership in what I call administrative agendas. Excuse me, I'm batting with the flu bug, so I'll be coughing once in a while. But we tie up our leaders with administrative agendas for programs and services, very little on the political agenda. So a lot of what I'll be highlighting is what I call a political agenda. And you'll see how it impacts on us. But I want to start, first of all, with one of the most sensitive things that are affecting our people today, the cows and plows settlement that's going on. The feds have now changed that to not just cows and plows provisions of treaty, but agricultural provisions of treaty. And in their settlement through the specific claims process, there's a settlement agreement that includes a clause, it's a release clause, so that everything that you agree to for settlement on the agricultural treaty annuities, you'll be terminating them. Oh, excuse me. So when we look at that process, you cannot terminate treaty annuities. They exist and they cannot be terminated. But the bands and the chiefs and councils, in many cases, are taking those treaty annuities to the claims process. And they're not claims. They're treaty annuities for implementation and enforcement of how you apply and enforce inherent rights, treaties, and treaty rights in every sector. So in the cows and plows one now on agriculture, some have added other treaty annuities, like the medicine chest clause is now added in that settlement process, and other treaty annuities that they've listed in their settlement agreements. And in that settlement agreement, like I said, there's a release clause that will terminate all their treaty annuities that are in that settlement agreement. Now, you can't make changes to the terms of a treaty through a claims process. They're not claims. How do you do that? If you want to make changes to terms of treaty, then you have to implement the national powers of treaty making and the Crown Indian Nations treaty relations process, and go to the table on the equality of government jurisdictional law on both sides of that table, and you negotiate whatever it is you have to negotiate for implementation. So if we're not happy with the cows and plows and agricultural provisions of Treaty 6, we can update them to fit the current 2024 agricultural economy today. That's what can be done. That's the only option that there is to making changes in the terms of treaty. You cannot do it through claims processes. That's totally illegal. So many bands now have settled their cows and plows agricultural settlement agreements with a release clause built right into their settlement agreements. So they've terminated those rights and benefits under the treaties. And there's no mention at all about the inherent rights. So I want to go to that issue for a bit of who I am and who you are. When I talk about that, I'm talking about the inherent sovereignty that we have as governments of nations, with the national powers of governing all our internal, external, and international affairs and intertribal affairs. It includes the national powers of treaty making and how we made the international treaties with the Crown in right of England and Ireland and our nations. Through the innovation of the Crown theory, the British Parliament and the Empire of England transferred responsibilities for the Crown and right of Ireland and England to the Crown and right of Canada. There's no law governing that process. It's just a theory that they developed for royal assent to do the transfer of treaty obligations and responsibilities from one crown to the other. So right now, the Crown and right of Canada has assumed the responsibility for the numbered treaties that are international treaties. Now, getting back to the inherent rights, we have inherent sovereignty. We have inherent rights by sector, like the inherent right to education, inherent right to economics, inherent right to health, inherent right to citizenship, membership, inherent right to title to lands, resources, water, jurisdiction for airspace. And I could go on with those lists of inherent rights, including your hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, inherent rights throughout your traditional ancestral territory. So when we look at that whole process of the inherent rights we have, where do they come from? The late Judge Lammer from the Supreme Court said years ago, all your rights supersede everything, he said. But I got two questions, he said. Where do they come from and what are they? So I've just listed you a few of those inherent rights that we have, and they're pretty major. And he never got any answer before he passed on. But then the late Judge Dixon, the Supreme Court judge, took it over and dealt with it a little more formally. So when I list these inherent rights that we have, inherent sovereignty we have, inherent title that we have, that inherent title guarantees the sovereignty of our nations remaining intact in the title to all the lands, resources, water, and jurisdiction for airspace. That was changed under the Indian Act, putting all the lands, resources, and water and jurisdiction for airspace under federal jurisdiction through the Indian Act. And now they've made even further changes to that to terminate the reserved lands and set up federal municipalities under the Indian Act. So that's what's being done today. So what we need is our own inherent title to Land and Resources Act, our own Environmental Waters Act, and so on, to deal with that issue. So when we go back then to the inherent rights that I say is a code of silence, like I said, now we need to list them because we're allowing the courts and governments to list them for us, and their list is getting smaller and smaller. But they're not only doing that, they're defining them. It's our responsibility to define our inherent rights, our inherent sovereignty, our form of government, our form of citizenship membership, and so on. How do we do that? Well, we do it through our languages of our nations. How? Based on our worldview, our philosophy, our traditions, our customs, our practices, our values and beliefs. That's how we define them. And once all that is done, you've now listed them, you've defined them, but there's a special, unique duty, individual and collective duty and responsibility for each of those inherent rights. We don't even teach that anymore. Yet that's what we have and that's who we are. So why aren't we coming together to deal with these issues collectively, right at the band level, between the First Nations, between the governments of First Nations, between the councils of First Nations, and so on? Well, then you have them now identified, defined, and you've identified your collective individual duties and responsibilities for each one of them. What are your plans and strategies you have to implement them? How do you implement the inherent right to education, the inherent right to health, the inherent right to economics, the inherent right to justice, the inherent title to lands, resources, water, and jurisdiction for airspace, the inherent right for citizenship membership, the inherent right to hunt, fish, trap, and gather, the inherent right to our own economy, our own justice system. And like I said, I could go on and on with the list of inherent rights we have. So when you have those plans then identified for implementation, how do you implement them? Well, you have to construct a schedule of new, special, and unique laws under the government's jurisdiction and laws of our nations. Now, all the things that I've talked about so far affects every individual Indian, affects Indians collectively, affects every band of the nations collectively, affects every chief and council collectively. It affects every nation collectively. So why aren't we doing it with this type of issue that I'm talking about? Now, that's a political agenda that I just highlighted for you. And that's what UNDRIP recognizes. And we want to give legal effect to UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's how we do it. But what are we waiting for? We're waiting for the feds to decide how they're going to do it under Bill C-15 that gives legal effect to UNDRIP. Well, they're not going to do what I just said. That's our duty and responsibility. So why aren't we coming together to get it done? And you'll see a need for a new schedule of laws, unique and special laws, implementing inherent rights by sector, implementing our inherent sovereignty, of our nations and the national powers of governing, national powers of treaty making, and maintaining the treaty crown treaty relationship. So when we look at that process, then you see when our people negotiated treaties, how did they exercise the national powers of treaty making? Well, everything I just highlighted for you, our inherent sovereignty, our inherent title to lands, resources, water, and jurisdictions for airspace, our inherent rights by sector for education, health, and so on. Judge Lammer said, where do they come from? Well, they're granted to our nations and our peoples by the Creator. They come from nowhere else, not from a treaty or any federal laws or jurisdiction. But when you look at that process then of how they're negotiated by treaty, the inherent sovereignty, the inherent rights by sector, the inherent title to the land and resources and so on, by the national powers of treaty making, they're reserved, they're recognized, they're confirmed, and they're guaranteed by the national powers of treaty making, and they're recognized by the international treaties that we've made with the Crown. Now that's the lawful political recognition of how we move forward to give legal effect to our own inherent rights, inherent sovereignty, inherent title. So when do we put that on the agenda for our communities to deal with, chiefs and councils to deal with, our tribal councils to deal with, the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations to deal with, the AFN to deal with? Everybody's proceeding on their own terms. But when they deal with treaties, there's some things that don't happen when they address treaties. I've been to many sessions where treaties are being discussed. The presenters talk about treaties, and they go right to treaty rights. They don't discuss anything about what I just highlighted for you in terms of our status of inherent rights, inherent sovereignty, inherent title, and so on, and how it impacts on us and how we have to implement it. Now, what do you think our people were talking about, the elders and the former leaders? They said, don't forget, you have to implement the spirit and intent of treaty. What were they saying? Well, everything we had prior to making treaties existed during treaty making and at post-treaty, after treaties were done, because they're reserved, they're recognized, they're confirmed, and guaranteed by the powers of treaty making and the treaties. So when you leave out dealing with the inherent sovereignty, the inherent rights, inherent title, and dealing with implementing treaty rights and treaties, you're missing the whole spirit and intent of treaty implementation. Because now you have inherent rights, you have treaties and treaty rights that's lawfully recognized by the framework that exists. And I'll highlight that for you too, in order to put things in perspective. But anyway, so we now have treaties, and the national powers of treaty making requires that the governments that are parties to treaty have to give them legal effect under their government jurisdiction laws of their nations. Now in treaties 1 to 11, we haven't done that, neither has the Crown done that. So Treaty 6 was taken to the UN by the elders and chiefs and officials from Hobima several years ago to get the UN to declare the status of Treaty 6. So the UN declared under the international treaty law that Treaty 6 is an international treaty. But the condition to maintain the status of an international treaty is that both parties have to give them legal effect under their government's jurisdiction and laws. Now that's not being done. Like I said, why not? If we want to give legal effect to our inherent rights and treaty rights to education, how do we do it? We do it through a traditional contemporary education system, highlighting all the programs that are impacted by the inherent right to education, all the programs that are inherited as treaty rights to education. And our laws have to govern those standards for those programs. Right now, we have no laws governing program standards. So everyone is using their discretion, and they're turning their colonial powers onto our own people and rejecting them for the things that they're entitled to. Now, the feds are really enjoying that, of course, along with the province. So I'm giving you a lot of detail, but it's a code of silence that I keep talking about, that we don't discuss and debate at the meetings that we go to at any level. And it's critical at this stage in our history that we start formally dealing with these issues I'm talking about. If we don't, there'll be nothing left for the next generation. And I'll show you how they're doing that. So when we implement the inherent rights and treaty rights to education through a traditional contemporary education system, what's wrong with us coming up with a Indian Nations Traditional Contemporary Education Act that applies at every level? Because all those issues, the inherent right to education, the treaty right to education, apply to every one of us in the same way. Every one of our nations in the same way. Every band of our nations in the same way. All our people collectively and individually in the same way. So why are we running around developing special acts, community by community, when they should be broad-based acts of legislation that every nation can apply collectively? See, historically, we had what they called the 500-year calendar. It's not like April, May, June, and July. What that was a path and a plan for 500 years on how to implement the common areas of the nation's business that applied on every nation, every government of the nation, and the peoples of the nation. And they met regularly to update that 500-year calendar. And what I'm talking about so far affects every nation in the same way. So why can't we have reintroduce that 500-year calendar that makes our people responsible for their duties and responsibilities associated with who they are and what we have to do as governments? So when you get back to the process, then you now know that we have inherent rights. That's who we are. You now know we have treaties. And the UN said in order to maintain the international status of treaties, each party has to give them legal effect under their government jurisdiction and laws. Now that's homework we have to do, because we even have our own people and a lot of our own leaders rejecting federal legislation for implementing their duties, legal, fiscal, trust obligations for inherent rights treaties and treaty rights in every sector. So they passed the Child Welfare Act, giving legal effect to Section 35 now. And I told Minister Bennett and Joe Wild prior to that, all those acts you've passed, you say they're new acts, your Self-Government Act, your Election Act, your Finance Administration Act, your Land Management Act. I said, they're all passed under Section 9124 of the BNA Act. And you've done that deliberately to avoid having to deal with the broader recognition that's under Section 35 of the Constitution Act of Canada now since 1982. So when they passed it, Bill C-92 on child welfare, recognizing our jurisdiction for child welfare, and in that act, they got two parts to it. One, you can implement your own jurisdiction for child welfare under your own government jurisdiction and laws. And there's a section in that act that provides for entering into a government-to-government agreement with the feds, where they recognize your jurisdiction and laws, but also they maintain their legal, fiscal, jurisdictional responsibilities for child welfare. And in the other section, you can go to the province, and the province can delegate your authority over child welfare. And that's what several bands have done. You don't need the province engaged in the process. And when Minister Bennett done that, she come looking for me in Ottawa at an AFN assembly, and she found me. She said, "It's done." She said, "We've done it. We've given legal effect to Section 35 now." I said, "Yeah, thank you. There's a couple of changes you should make, but you've done something else," I told her. And she took a few steps back, and she said, "What did we do now?" She said. I said, "Well, you've implemented UNDRIP." Oh, she grabbed her mouth and held her face, and she said, "Yes, we did." He said, "Now you see, that's a minister of the Crown, not recognizing what they did to give legal effect to UNDRIP. Now, what are we doing to give legal effect to UNDRIP? I highlighted right from the start what do we have to do to get it done the right way, not piece by piece, you know. You can't deal with these comprehensive issues going one issue at a time. So we got to wake up and get serious about where things are going. So now I've highlighted for you our inherent rights, our inherent title, our inherent sovereignty, our national powers of governing, our national powers of treaty making, and our unique and special laws that we have to make for implementing inherent rights and treaty rights. And I've highlighted for you the status of the treaties and how we have to implement them. And what's missing is the how, eh? People can talk about these things, but they don't go to the how because they don't know it. That's one of the main problems we got today. So the other thing that you should know, again, a code of silence. Treaties 1 to 11 forms one major treaty between the Crown and Indian nations. So the Medicine Chest Clause in Treaty 6 applies to all the treaties 1 to 11. Now, our people don't even know that in most cases. When you take the provisions, just the written text of the provisions of treaties 1 to 11, that's a hell of a powerful treaty. And you add the oral evidence on treaty making, like I'm talking about, that makes it even more powerful. So why do you think the feds, the Crown, is afraid to give legal effect to those treaties? That's one of the major issues they're dealing with. And now they're trying to pick us off, band by band, treaty issue by treaty issue. And that's what they're doing. And I'll show you how. But what governs the Crown Indian Nations relations then? Now, this is the big picture. Again, a code of silence. Since 1982, the Crown Indian Nations relations changed in a major way under federal Crown responsibilities. Not for us, because everything we were pushing for and want to do is what's now recognized in this major framework. And what is the major framework governing Crown Indian Nations relations? What is that major legal political framework governing the Crown Indian Nations relations? And how is it governed? Well, first of all, it's governed by the inherent rights that I highlighted for you. And to start with, it's governed by our inherent sovereignty and the Crown's assumed sovereignty. Now, I've been accused of creating that term, Crown's assumed sovereignty. That's not Saul Sanderson's term. That's their own Supreme Court that made that decision in recognizing the status of the sovereignty of Canada. It's only assumed sovereignty. Why? Because they entered into the international treaties with Indian nations that have to be implemented and enforced. But what they're busy doing now is they're trying to terminate them. But nevertheless, they govern that framework that I'm talking about. And you can even add some of the other treaties, like the J Treaty. Then comes the other instrument that governs that framework called the Bill of Rights. And that's what Judge Dixon called it. Supreme Court Judge Dixon. I met with him during the patriation of the Constitution and during the amendments to the Constitution of Canada, right from the start to the finish of that process. First meeting I went into his office on, he said, Chief, he said, I want to give you my interpretation as a Supreme Court judge of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. He said, now those are royal instructions from the Crown and Right of England and Ireland and the British Parliament. Royal instructions to the Crown and Right of Canada and the federal government and the federal parliament, he said, in the form of a Bill of Rights. That's what I see the Royal Proclamation providing for. It's our form of Bill of Rights, not yours. You'll need your own. So under that Bill of Rights, it recognizes everything you've come to meet me about. The recognition of your sovereignty of your nations is under the Royal Proclamation of 1763, our Bill of Rights. Recognizes all those inherent rights you have on your chart listed there. And it recognizes something even more important, he said. It recognizes your inherent title to all the lands, resources, waters, and jurisdiction for airspace. And it will continue to maintain the national, international treaty making between the Crown and Indian nations that cannot be terminated. But, like I said, my interpretation of that Bill of Rights is like of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It's like a Bill of Rights, but you will lead your own. Now, you see, what have we done to give legal effect to our inherent rights, our treaties, and so on? Nothing. What's wrong with us? You got to ask yourselves, why aren't we getting it done? So what are we doing instead? I'll cover that. So now the other instrument governing that framework, I said, inherent sovereignty of our nations, assumed sovereignty of the Crown, inherent rights and title, treaties and treaty rights, Royal Proclamation of 1763, and now it includes Constitution Act of 1982. And it's amazing to me that many people don't understand what Section 35 is in the Constitution. Like Section 35(1) now recognizes everything I just talked about. It recognizes our inherent sovereignty, recognizes our title to land, resources, and water and jurisdiction for airspace, recognizes all our inherent rights. And now it recognizes our treaty and treaty rights as well. So what are we waiting for? You see, we fought like hell to get there. We're there now. But now our own people are engaged in implementing the colonial policies. And I'll show you how. Now, this is a pretty major political agenda I'm talking about. It would guarantee things for the next 7 generations. As a young leader, one of the elders took me aside. He said, young man, he said, I got to tell you something. He said, you're going to be a leader that's going to make policies, make plans and strategies for our people and our nations. And if you're going to do that right, you need to know their history and you need to know our history. If you don't know it, you'll make plans and strategies that create barriers for the next generation. That's not your job. Your job is to create plans and strategies that they can build on. So that's what I've been doing all my life. As difficult as it has been to deal with governments on the recognition that we have today, it's done. And I didn't do it myself. All of the former leaders and elders worked like hell to get it done. Both Indian and Métis leaders, by the way, not just Indian leaders. So when we look at that whole process with the Constitution Act of 1982, Section 35, what else does it do? It takes over the powers of the federal government under 9124 of the BNA Act, where they're responsible for Indians and Indian lands in a major way. And that's what they're trying to prevent from having to implement. And they can't, because it's a constitutional recognition. So the judge said Section 35 recognizes your inherent rights and title, like the proclamation does, he said. So the treaty making process still exists, he said, and that should be implemented annually for your treaty review of your laws and your governing powers and implementation plans and strategies. So then Section 35 does something else. 35.1. It takes over the provincial powers under the 92 of the BNA Act. All the provincial powers fall under Section 35.1 under federal jurisdiction when it comes to Crown Indian Nations relations. That's why the feds have to implement especially a unique schedule of laws, recognizing and implementing their legal, fiscal, jurisdictional trust obligations for inherent rights, treaties, and treaty rights in every sector. So they started with Bill C-92 on child welfare, but they've stopped there. Because like I said, many of our own leaders and people are resisting the implementation of federal law. So I ask them, when I hear them talk like that, okay, you're resisting federal law and policy, then why are you implementing provincial law and policy? They have no jurisdiction whatsoever. And you're violating the constitutional treaty process that governs us. And they can't say nothing. I said, besides, why aren't you talking about our own laws and jurisdiction for implementation? Not sit there and apply provincial law and jurisdiction like you are. That's violating everything. So now Section 35, you see, now it takes over Section 92 powers provincially. That's why the feds have to have that unique and special schedule of laws I'm talking about. And that unique and special schedule of laws have to provide for the implementation of inherent rights and title, treaties and treaty rights in every sector under a new form of federal laws, not the laws that they're implementing now that are based on their genocide colonial policies. And I'll highlight that for you. So now we have as well the UN Declaration that forms that framework. I'm still identifying the comprehensive recognition, legal political framework governing Crown Indian Nations relations. So the UNDRIP now recognizes everything I just talked about for implementation. But we're waiting for the feds to do something. What the hell are we waiting for? We already have it all. We just need to act on it and get it done. That's what I'm saying. At every level, people in the communities collectively, the bands collectively, chiefs and councils collectively. In other words, our governments of our nations collectively, and our nations collectively. So then we have now, under UNDRIP, we have the Organization of American States Declaration. That, again, is a code of silence that most people know nothing about. But it recognizes a lot of our inherent rights and the treaties, and we're not using it. So, and of course, all the international conventions that are there still apply, governing the framework, the legal political framework between the Crown and Indian nations. Now, that's a hell of a comprehensive legal political recognition, is it not? So everything that we've been fighting for and talking about. So what do? How do we implement it? Well, we implement what's recognized. What does that comprehensive legal political framework recognize? First of all, the inherent sovereignty of our nations. the Crown's assumed sovereignty. It recognizes the Crown Indian nations relations, recognizes the Crown treaty relations, Crown Indian nations treaty relations. It recognizes the inherent rights that I talked about and the treaties. So when we move forward with implement, it recognizes the inherent sovereignty of our nations, the nation-to-nation relationship, the government-to-government relationship, the inherent rights and title relationship, treaties and treaty rights relationship. In what form? Well, the political relations is recognized in the form of the recognition of the equality of government, jurisdiction, law, and courts. Are we implementing that? No. We're buying into the Indian Affairs self-government, setting up municipal governments on our reserves by ban. And that's illegal. You're terminating your status as a legal party to treaty, but also giving up your powers of governing, like I highlighted already. So when you move forward then and looking at what they're doing in that process, in implementing the equality of government, jurisdiction, law, all you got to do is go across the U.S. border. You have tribal government, state government, federal government, jurisdiction, law, and courts being implemented. And of course, you'll have to deal with the interface of jurisdiction and law as well. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But now in Canada, what do we have? We have in Quebec the French Civil Code, which is French law. And for all the rest of Canada, they're implementing the English common law. And they have the interface of French law and English common law already being implemented in Canada. So now we're going to be implementing our own sovereignty under our own government, jurisdiction, laws, and courts. How? Just exercising those powers of governing I talked about, asserting the national powers of treaty making and the treaties. But the process that I highlighted for you also recognizes judicial relations. In what form? Now I've covered political relations, treaty relations, judicial relations in the form of us having our own justice system. We can holler all we want and complain all we want about their justice system and their laws being discriminating against us. Well, what the hell are we hollering about? Let's just do it and occupy the field with our own laws and jurisdiction, but not just on reserve by ban, throughout our national territories and implementing our jurisdiction and laws collectively. And we can't even come to do that. Why not? We've done it in the past, we can do it now. So then we have our own justice system, our own judicial relations with the federal, provincial judicial processes and relationships. And that's where that interface of jurisdiction law will, jurisdiction and laws will take major on the relationships. Just in education alone, you'll have federal, provincial disputes on the inherent rights and treaty rights to education. You'll have federal Indian nations jurisdiction in the same way, Indian provincial jurisdiction law. So that's what's going to be created by implementing the equality of government, jurisdiction, law, and courts in our own justice system. But what are we doing now? We're dealing with those disputes using their laws, using their institutions. And we're not happy with what they're deciding. Well, let's get on with it. We have the authority and mandate to do what I'm talking about. What are we waiting for? Let's get it done. So we'd have our own traditional contemporary Justice Act, applying that whole field. Again, then comes the economic relations. Where is our own economy? Our own economy that's community-based, regional, national, international. Excuse me. But our own economy then would identify our inherent rights, and treaty rights in every sector of the economy, like for the hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering sector, or harvesting, forestry, the use of forestry, waters, and so on. So that economy then would apply by community, regionally, national, internationally. And Paul Martin said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Do you have commerce?" I said, "Yeah, it's right up in the corner on that chart you're looking at." I said, "Well, I mean, what the hell do you mean?" I said, "That's where you made all your laws and policies to restrict us from generating our own economy, and revenue and economy, and getting it going. Well, those days are gone. We're going to get it done on our terms and our conditions. And in every sector of that economy, we'll identify our equity and our ownership in every sector of that economy based on our inherent rights and title, treaties and treaty rights in every sector of that economy. And it'll be implemented through our own Trade and Commerce Act. And the federal court, the Supreme Court in Quebec, just recognized the other day the international powers and governing of the Six Nations for gaming. The two people that got charged, the judge threw it out and said, no, the nation has the international jurisdiction and powers for trade relations. So you see it's happening. And Section 35 provides for that recognition too. See? So then comes, after the economic relations, that will be applied by community, regionally, nationally, internationally, is the fiscal relations. We're still using budgets based on the allocations of money they give us. Those aren't budgets. We need comprehensive budgeting in every sector, implementing our inherent rights and treaty rights in every sector. Some chiefs and councils now in bands are budgeting just for treaty rights. Well, that's not implementing the spirit and intent of treaty. You have to budget for inherent rights and treaty rights. So you only budget for treaty rights to education. You're only getting half the money you're entitled to. So where are we going? We're still signing contributions to bands agreements, contract with the feds to implement their programs. And their programs only have policies. There's no law governing their programs, like I said earlier. You see? Then we have no laws governing the programs that they're implementing either. We got to get our act together in a major way, you see? So when you move forward then with implementing the fiscal relations, then we have our own Finance Administration Act. And I done that in 1972 when I was a chief at James Smith. First thing I done was develop our own Finance Administration Act. And I drafted a government-to-government fiscal agreement under their Finance Administration Act and ours. Officials came out from Regina and they said, we're not signing this. We have no authority. I said, bring your lawyer next week. So they brought him. Sitting across from me, he said, Chief, what did you want me here for? They didn't even tell him why he was coming. So I told him, I said, I have my own Finance Administration Act here, and you have your own Federal Finance Administration Act. And I drafted this government-to-government fiscal agreement. He said, let me see it. So he flipped through it in about 20 minutes. He flipped to the back page and told them, sign it. And what did that do? That gave me access to all the federal departments and ministries, including Treasury Board and Finance, not just Indian Affairs, you see. And because we set up the first Indian Control School in Canada there at that time, and moved with our own Cree government jurisdiction and laws, they cut us off 3 times in 1 year. When I went to Canada Manpower, for some of your older people like me will remember Canada Manpower, it has some programs called Flip, Leap, and Flop. But it guaranteed $500,000 a year for 5 years. And I went there and I accessed funding without Indian Affairs funding. And when I walked into the office as chief, I had a band administrator, and a welfare administrator, 2 employees. We went from 2 employees to 165 employees in 6 weeks. And we introduced the degree program for teacher ed and social work right in our school on our reserve. So then I set up a guaranteed annual income, taking all the social assistance money and unemployment money and implemented a guaranteed annual income for members, for families. And the clerk to Privy Council a few years ago, if Elsie and I met her before Christmas, he said, "You've done something positive with SA." He said, "Before we start the meeting, you're going to tell me what you did." She said, because our social assistant is one hell of a mess right from here right down to the band office. She said, "Now I want to hear what you did." So I told her, I took all your social assistance money that you provided and I matched it with the unemployment money and I created an economic subsidy. I said, he said, "What's that?" "Well, every family needs rent or mortgage payments. They need utilities paid. They need food. They need transportation. If they're working, they need child welfare and family support." So that's what I did. I guaranteed every family that, plus individuals. And that was a very positive investment of social assistance money. And so then Indian Affairs had cut me off funding, forgetting that a lot of the funding they cut off was statutory funding that they were obligated for. So I just kept track of what we spent and how, and I invoiced them. And when we're not paying it, we'll see you in small claims court because those are statutory obligations. So we got paid. But you see, that's the politics of things that are there even today. Like you can't go into self-government unless you buy into the federal self-government policies and their termination policies. So then when you look at the fiscal relations one, then I developed a comprehensive model for budgeting way back then. And I've been showing it around. And some bands are looking at trying to move ahead with implementing it, because it's very comprehensive. Just for your information, the bands are only getting 17% of the money they're entitled to right now. That's all. And it's just coming from Crown Indigenous Services. So I met with Mark Miller when he was the minister here in Saskatoon before Christmas last year. And I said, "Minister, you got a major problem." I said, "Your officials, your med deputies and ADMs, senior officials and employees know nothing about the comprehensive legal political framework governing Crown Indian Nations relations. And I brought these charts and these documents for you because they're not being implemented." And he said, "Saul," he said, "I don't know them either." He said, "Now this is a minister of the Crown, but Section 35 now opens up that door federally for fiscal relations and financing. Bands can not only go to Crown Indigenous Services, they can go to every federal ministry and department, including Treasury Board and Finance, for their funding. And they're still signing contributions agreements, limiting themselves to Crown Indigenous Services that only has 17% of the funding." And we met Dr. Ottman and I from FNUC, met with the minister in a Zoom meeting, the current minister. And he said, "I support the funding that you're looking for and that you want," he said. "But nationally," he said, "I don't have enough money in my budget to finance Métis and Indian and Inuit people and their needs." I said, "Yeah, Minister, you only have 17% of the funding from Parliament. But," I said, "Section 35 now allows us to go to all your ministries and departments, Treasury Board and Finance, and we can access 100% of the money we need with your help." I said, "Oh yes," he said, "we can do that." I said, "You're damn right we can do it." I said, "We done it in 1972. I said, "How long ago was that?" I said, "Surely the hell we can do it now." Oh, yes, yes. He said, I'll get my staff working on it right away. And I said, the federal provincial transfer funding for supplementary funding in health, social services, education, and income security. I said, first of all, that transfer in health is major supplementary money for primary health care. We don't get primary health care funding. We get public care funding only. Now I said, Minister and the First Ministers met, and the Prime Minister announced 969 billion for primary health care funding over 10 years to the provinces. Not a damn cent to First Nations for primary health care. But they went and cut off the primary health care funding for nurses and doctors, expecting the provinces to step up with that new money to finance that. Well, they're not concerned about financing those kinds of costs for Indians at any level and anywhere. So that money is out there, but we got none of it. So that's for health in that sector of that transfer. And that sector provides for hospitals, maintaining hospitals, dental care, optometrist care, statutory care, not discretionary care like they have in their policies for us. Then it guarantees levels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in care and special needs. On the social development side of that pie, money for elders care and home care. Don't we need that? Yeah, we need that. But we're not getting a damn cent from it. Be transferred to the provinces. And we have child welfare being transferred from the feds to the provinces. They don't put any money into Indian child welfare. That's all federal money that they're getting from the feds. Then they have levels 1, 2, 3, 4 care and special needs under welfare, social services. So now you see you have an overlapping jurisdiction on the fiscal issue just on that social transfer of funding impacting on health and social development. And you ask why we have gaps in the services, major disputes going on, jurisdiction and fiscal disputes going on that cause those major gaps and denial of services for our people, both on and off reserve. So then you have the funding for post-secondary ed, for education, training, major transfers of money to provinces to finance their universities and provide for scholarships. And Treasury Board provides for major research funding to universities. And they get major multi-million dollars for researching on Indians, Métis, and Inuit through those universities. And our people participate in it. That's their validation for having Indian consent to get their millions of dollars that should be coming to us. So then on the income security side, they have the Canada Pension Plan and the Quebec Pension Plan. I was pushing for our own pension plan for years. Before I left, I finally got the commitment that we would be paying into a pension plan and get pensions. That was just 2 years before I quit office. And I tried it for many years to get it done. So it's there now. What I wanted was an Indian First Nations Canada pension plan. I think that still can be done. Then comes the unemployment money that's there yet. EI, I think they call it today. And the veterans programs, of course, that they're entitled to. I'd like to see more for them, but that's not happening. And our own veterans, Métis and Indian veterans, lost total benefits after they returned from war as veterans. That's unfinished business for the veterans and their families. Even if they've passed on, their families are still entitled to those lands that the veterans got and to the other benefits that the veterans got. So that income security then still provides for your child welfare, child tax credit. And you see when they had us pay GST how did they get us to pay GST? Well, they sent out the forms for the mom and dad to apply for the child tax credit. And when they signed the forms, they weren't told that they were also agreeing to pay GST. So that's how they got us paying GST federally. And you see, under tax law, of course, as a chief, I pushed that we have tax immunity. And when Trudeau set up the law review process, he had a law review secretariat and Privy Council, which is the next office to the Prime Minister's Office of Canada, a law review secretariat in INAC, Justice and Finance. So they called me. They said, we want to talk with you about the unique and special laws that we have to make that you keep telling us about. We need about 3 hours, right in the middle of the pandemic. I was on a Facebook like this one. I was on Zoom with him. I said, okay, we're going to touch on the first one that's most sensitive to you and me. You call it taxation. Now, I said, how many of you know anything about tax immunity? Not one. Now, these are senior government officials I'm talking about. And I said, well, tax immunity, your Revenue Canada has just done a secret study a couple of years ago on what I'm talking about. How come you don't know about it? I said, why do we have tax immunity? I said, we have tax immunity because we have sovereignty. We have tax immunity because we have international treaties. And we can't be taxed by a municipality, a province, or the federal government. And then we have tax exemption. Now you know about the tax exemption under the Indian Act, but you fall off the edge of the reserve, you're no longer tax exempt. They can tax you. But under the treaties, tax exemption for the goods and services that are to be provided by the Crown, and that's why you're collecting tax, to be able to pay for those goods and services that we're entitled to at your cost under the treaties. But the socioeconomic benefits and terms and conditions of treaty also create for a tax exemption. So then what do we do? Well, you make changes to your laws. You can't tax us in any form, anywhere. No such thing as an on-reserve, off-reserve Indian taxation. And the other thing that you got to know, I said, everything that we're talking about and going to be dealing with, all those inherent rights, inherent title, treaties and treaty rights, and our sovereignty are portable. They're portable by community, between communities, between our nations and province-wide, federally, national tax immunity, tax exemption is portable, and internationally. And they said, oh my God, they said, our colleagues have to hear this. But you see, we don't even deal with that today, Rick. We're still applying the off-reserve, on-reserve Indian policies with the funding that the chiefs and councils and tribal councils are getting, when they should be budgeting for the total population, regardless of residence, you see? And the government knows that, but we're not doing it. We're not budgeting that way. So then you look at the process of implementation then of our political relations, treaty relations, judicial relations, economic relations, fiscal relations, international relations. Those are portable. All the rights we have are portable. Inherent rights and title, treaties and treaty rights are portable. But do we go there? No, we don't. We don't go there. Now, when we look at the process that I'm talking about, that highlights for you the comprehensive legal political framework that I keep talking about. That is a political agenda that we have to implement. And I'm doing a document on that. It'll highlight that, and I got charts to identify that. But now, let's go to another area that I call silence. And so many places I've gone, things I just talked about are not known. But even what I'm going to tell you now is not known. And I'm going to talk about the empire colonial policies. Empires of England, Spain, France, and Portugal divvied up the world. Spain had South Central America. England Empire had North America, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of India. And the Portugal and France had Africa. That's how they divided up the world, for their empires to take possession of territorial lands and resources and implement their governing powers. So they realized that they stole our lands and resources. I'm talking about the governments and the leaders of those empires now. So they wanted some way to validate the theft of the lands and resources from our people. So many years before that, they coined a term that is being used today yet. The term indigenous was coined in 7 ACD or whatever it's called, 700 ACD. That's how long ago that term was coined. And that was the term was coined by the empires to identify the original peoples of the world. So today in 2024, indigenous now means Métis, Indian, and Inuit. So they used the term for all these years and defined it for whatever purpose they needed to use it for. And they're still doing that. So they're saying that we have inherent rights. I'm saying we have inherent rights. They say we have indigenous rights, Aboriginal rights. Well, a code of silence. What did the empires do to get the validation of their theft of lands and resources from our people and our nations? How many know about the 1493 Papal Bull? I ask that question wherever I go. Hardly anybody. A lot of times, nobody. Well, that's who the empires went to. They went to the bishop of the Catholic Church in 1493 to validate the illegal theft of the lands and resources from the original peoples of the world. So what did the Pope do? He issued a papal bull of 1493. What does it say? It says indigenous peoples are not human nor Christian. Because indigenous peoples are not human, they don't have sovereignty in government. Because indigenous peoples are not human, they don't have titles to lands and resources. Now, isn't that exactly what those leaders of the empire wanted to hear? Yes. But he also said, because indigenous peoples are not human, they don't have rights. Now, those policies of the doctrine of discovery are not known either. And the one I just highlighted for you is not known. But they're being implemented yet in 2024. How? Well, many historians will say, oh, the papal bull and the doctrine of discovery died in the 17th century. And if I'm there, I said, like hell it did. What did the empires do? They said, we don't know. Well, don't you know anything about the 1830 detribalization policies? They said, no. Well, what are those? Well, you'll recognize them today. And they're based on the doctrine of discovery and the papal bull objectives that I just highlighted. And the objectives of the 1830 detribalization policies is civilization, integration, and Christianization. That's where the residential schools came from. Assimilation and liquidation. So civilization, Christianization, integration, assimilation, and liquidation. And here we are, 2024, talking about them, but more than that, we're implementing them. And people can't tie those policies of 500 years ago to now. And that's where the major racism comes from, discrimination created by that papal bull and the doctrine of discovery stuff, and reinforced in 1830. And that also created a situation where they made empire laws, church laws. Those objectives of the papal bull were implemented under Christian law by the churches and the governments of the nations worldwide. And they immediately made laws to outlaw our sovereignty by outlawing our government's jurisdiction and our governments of our nations under their laws. And they went further than that as well. In 1830, when they passed the 1830 detribalization policies, they made laws. Canada didn't have a government to make laws, so the Crown still made the laws through the British Empire and British government, English common law. And that's where you see the list of laws that people know about today. Laws outlawing our language, our culture, our traditions, our customs, our practices, our economy, and you name it. Outlawing our hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, all those things being outlawed under the 1830 detribalization policies, the 1493 papal bull, and the doctrine of discovery. So then what happened after that? Well, that started a major development that impacts on us today. It impacted on us in a way that we lost total control of our way of life. We lost total control of our political developments and of our governments and of our nations. We lost total control of our rights and our status. Lost total control of our lands and resources. And I could go on and on for you on how we've been affected by the loss of control. But what happens when a society and a people and a community loses that degree of control that we lost? People keep saying, well, where does discrimination come from? How come we have all these conditions, third world conditions? Well, when you lose that degree of power and jurisdiction that I just highlighted, that's a major loss of your way of life, major loss of your government, and so on. What happens? All the negative symptoms kick into place. High suicides, poor health conditions, addictions, abuses. Go 4.5 pages line by line of major symptoms that we're dealing with today as a result of these policies, these colonial genocide policies I'm talking about. Now, how are they enforced in Canada? What are the Canadian colonial policies of genocide today? Well, Canada implemented the 1947 plan to liquidate Canada's Indian problems within 25 years. Now, when I go someplace, I ask, how many of you know about that plan? And again, hardly anybody knows about it. That's where they started the first process to start transferring Indian programming and responsibilities for Indians from federal jurisdiction to provincial jurisdiction. Started to terminate our international status of treaties and our treaty rights. They focused on terminating the special rights and status of Indians in 1947. And I could go on with you a list of things that they done in 1947. Not on a 25-year plan. So where does that take you to? The 69 white paper policy. And again, based on the objectives of the 1830 detribalization policies, the papal bull, and the doctrine of discovery. The 69 white paper policy, targeting the termination of the special rights and status of Indians. How? political instructions to terminate the special rights of status of Indians by amending existing laws or constructing new laws. So Bill C-31 now is terminating whole families, not just one Indian at a time. And our Chapans, our great-grandchildren, are being registered as 6'2" or 6'3" with Indian status, but being denied any benefits or rights under that category. And we're allowing that to happen right now in every one of our families. That's terminating their birth rights. And the inherent rights I talked about, those are your birth rights. And you inherit them from generation to generation, as granted to our people and nations by the Creator. What are we allowing them to do? Take that illegal action, terminate the special rights of those babies, great-grandchildren. That's birth. And now, you see, now we're still losing our children through the child care process as well, and in other ways as we move on. So where is our own Citizenship Act and Membership Code under our own laws and jurisdiction? I'm not talking about the Indian Act Membership Code, and that's what a lot of the bands bought into. Well, that doesn't give you any control over your citizenship or membership. Still falls under federal law and jurisdiction. But we can make our own laws governing our citizenship and membership. And that's what I told that group of law review secretariats after I dealt with the taxation issue. I said, the next issue we're going to talk about in terms of special laws, I said, you're going to do it with the Indian Act? Oh, yes, that's in the plans, they said. Well, that means you're not going to be registering and certifying Indians anymore. Yeah, we won't be registering any Indians anymore. I said, sorry, you've done something else. Besides treaties mandating that you have to, you've done something else. They said, what did we do now? I said, you passed the Constitution Act of 1982, Section 35(2) of the Constitution, that now recognizes the constitutional distinct recognition of Indian, distinct recognition of Métis, and distinct recognition of Inuit having citizenship status in Canada, not under the Indian Act. But you'll have to amend your Citizenship Act now to recognize everything that I talked to you about. As I told you, I'm a Cree, the Chickasaw Patient Band of the Cree Nation, will be certified and registered under our own Chickasaw Patient Cree Citizenship Act and Membership Code. And the framework that I talked about recognizes our capacity to do that, and the treaties guarantee that. So you'll have to amend your Citizenship Act now, a new part to it, to recognize everything I just told you about. And you'll have to recognize Saul Sanderson as being a citizen of the Chickasaw Patient Band of the Cree Nation and a member of the Chickasaw Patient Band with all my rights and stuff. And you're going to be responsible for that. And you will pay for that. And again, they said, oh my God, our law colleagues have to hear this. But you see, we're not even at that level of discussion amongst ourselves. What's going on? Why aren't we? You see? What are we doing? Nothing. So we're still losing great-grandchildren with only Indian status, but no special rights or benefits. You see? Now I could go on with the list of how we're losing our citizenship and membership in that way. So then comes the 69 white paper, like I said. That's where they introduced first generation devolution policies, how to step up the process of transferring Indian programming to provincial governments and transferring Indians and Indian lands to provincial governments. And That's illegal. So now they're changing the recognition of the special rights of Indians in programming from Indian programming federally to Indigenous programming federally, eliminating the special rights and status for Indians in terms of guaranteed programs and services for Indians under that framework, under the treaties, under the inherent rights and treaty rights. That's the first generation devolution policy in 1969. Then they stepped up the process. Starting in 1947 is when they initiated the process to set up local governments, municipal governments by ban of the nations. And they stepped up that process in 1969 under the white paper policy. That's where they come up with their self-government, inherent rights to self-government policies federally. 2024 still implementing it, but all tied to the objectives of the 1830 decolonization policies and objectives, the Papal Bull and the Doctrine of Discovery again. So I could go on with the list of items that they're dealing with under that 69 white paper yet for implementation and enforcement. But let's move ahead to 476, native policies. Now, politically, that's like yesterday, politically. What were the native policies for? It was to hire Indians, Métis, and Inuit in the front lines of governments, provincially and federally, to implement these policies I'm talking about. And to set up municipal governments on reserves. And to allow for the transfer of programs and services to the provinces with bands implementing jurisdiction and the laws of the province governing the programs and services to Indians both on and off reserve. That's the transition that's in place right now. And that was reinforced by our own people getting engaged with employment in government services in 74, 76. Now, some are ADMs, some are deputies. Are they still pushing the policies? Yes, they are. Why? There's going to be nothing left for their own grandchildren. But now we're up to 1980, the 1980 Buffalo Jump. And where I go, I say, how many know about the 1980 Buffalo Jump? Again, hardly anybody knows about it. Now in politics, surely, you see. And what is the 1980 Buffalo Jump? The second generation devolution policies to finish up the transfer of Indian programming and Indians from federal jurisdiction to provincial jurisdiction. So right now, through corporate entities that have been set up by the nation, by the Indian nations, by bands, tribal councils, FSIN, AFN, through provincial corporate law, creating education authorities, health authorities, all those different child care authorities and so on, all under provincial corporate law. Doing what? Implementing provincial law and jurisdiction. That has nothing to do with the recognition of inherent rights and title and treaty rights at all. But terminating the federal legal fiscal obligations and legal jurisdictional obligations for those programs and services for Indians. See? And they're happy to do that because they think they're going to get an awful lot of money. All they got to do is look to the south. On the US side, in 1955, Congress made a law to have the state governments take over tribal education, health, and social services, and so on, under tribal government jurisdiction laws. So the state governments amended their constitutions, some of them, but most of them constructed new law to do that. And the day came for the implementation by the tribes and the tribal chairman councils to get money to implement their programs and services from the state governments. The state governments had no money. Congress didn't give them any money. So they had to change their constitution, amend their laws, and hand it back to Congress. That's why today you see them still implementing what they call the HUE Act. Congress had to pass the HUE Act, a Health, Education, Welfare Act, taking responsibility for their inherent rights, treaties, and treaty rights to health, education, and welfare under their jurisdiction, fiscal trust obligations of Congress, of the federal government. Well, that's what's going to happen here. It'll happen. But you see, what's being planned right now is the provinces and the feds believe that they'll have enough corporate entities under provincial corporate law that there'll be no need to fund money, put away program and service money to chiefs and councils. They'll send all that money to the province, and the province will allocate the money to those corporate entities, those provincial corporate entities that they were setting up under provincial law and jurisdiction. And if they got money, yeah, it'll stay in place for 5 years. But after that, there's nothing stopping the province from terminating all those corporate entities, like they just done in their own health field, where they terminated all those health districts and formed one major one and created major surpluses, or made debt, in health services to their people and their communities. So that's where it's heading. See? Now I'm telling you, we're engaged in implementing all this. How? By those corporate entities that are being set up under provincial law and jurisdiction. When that framework that I outlined at the start is not being implemented because everybody's engaged in the administrative structure on the first generation devolution policies and the second generation devolution policies, and now the determination of our rights and benefits in the form of treaty annuities under the specific claims process. So when you look at their strategies then for implementing those colonial policies that I just highlighted for you, 500 years of genocide colonial policies that's being applied today. And I showed you how just now. And the majority of the people, officials and government leaders, cannot tie the history of 500 years ago to 2024. One regional official at a meeting I was at, the assembly, he said, "Now I'm not going to go back 100 years ago. That's history," he said. "That's all done and past," he said. And he didn't go there. And so I got up after. I said, "Well," I said, "I can help you out," I said. "But I know you didn't go there because, first of all, you didn't know anything about it." And I said, "Now here's how you tie in that 500 years of colonial policies today. And what you're doing is you're still extinguishing our rights and our benefits and our status. You're still engaged in terminating our special treaty rights, treaties. So nothing has changed. But we have a mandate and complete political mandate and authority, lawfully and politically, to make those changes that we're talking about that have to be made. Now that will require internal change, you see. And one of the elders said, never forget, change is constant. But change causes a lot of kind of conflict. But change takes a lot of time. He said, you're very impatient. Remember, 100 years of political change is like 1 year in your lifetime. So I've now spent over 65 years in this business, and I watched the changes happening. And I can tell you, they've taken a hell of a lot of work. And it's been worth it. And there's a lot of positive things that are going on out there now. But you'll hear nothing about the negative things that are created by the environment of these colonial policies. So I documented all this, provided them to the Archbishop of Canterbury when he came to Canada head of the Anglican Church, and he said he didn't know nothing about that history. So he said, "You got anything in writing?" I said, "Yes." "Well, you're going to be in PA at our assembly with the chiefs and bishops." He said, "I want you to come and do a presentation, but I want you to bring something to me in writing. The reason I want to get it in writing from you is because the Pope is coming to Canada, and I'm going to be meeting him when I get back to England before he comes to Canada. And I want to give him some documentation on the issues that you're talking about and how you've documented the need for the Pope to terminate the 1493 papal bull." So the Pope came. He denied the genocide policies until he flew home on his plane to Rome, and he announced the colonial policies being genocide policies. Then he went on to try to exempt the church from being engaged in them when they took a lead role in a lot of it. But anyway, just recently, he announced the recognition of the inherent human rights of Indigenous peoples. So he obviously got the document, you see, on inherent rights that I'm talking about. So it's not like he doesn't have the information, he's got it. But we still need that papal bull terminated. So when I go to gatherings or meetings, when I've done the presentation, I said, "Now, how many of you in here are Catholics?" I said. In one place, no hand went up. I said, "Good." I said, "Because if you're a Catholic, I'm going to ask you to go after your Pope and get him to change that damn policy." One of the elder ladies came up to the mic right after. He said, "He asked you how many are Catholic in here. And I'm going to ask you the same thing. How many of you are Catholic?" She put up her hand, and a whole bunch of hands went up of Catholic people in the assembly, not wanting to admit they were Catholic because of what I highlighted for them in terms of what their Pope did and still doing. So anyway, I've given you an awful lot, but that's painted you the big picture that people don't have information on. And you see the code of silence I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Pretty major. And we expect our leaders to do something, our people to take action. Well, they have to get to know this information I'm talking about if they're going to do it right. So I'm doing a briefing document on highlighting each of these areas, and the Senate want to review it, the Senate of FSIN, and they want to get it out to the chiefs and councils and the bands to start getting some rally going to light a fire under our feet,
Right.
get the things done right. And so there's more I could provide to you, but that's a lot of information.
Well, what strikes me, Saul, is you talked about the inherent rights, but you're saying there's responsibilities there that we're not fulfilling our side, our role as Indigenous
Right.
nations. But how can we fulfill that? I know the colonial strategy is, they they fulfilled it. So now with UNDRIP recognizing us as with human rights, with inherent rights, with treaty rights, but now our responsibility of even like our ancient treaties amongst each other, like
Yeah.
between the alliances, the confederacies. Is that what's needed today? Is
It's
is a major dialogue of indigenous sovereign treaty obligations or exercising our treaty obligations?
in our inherent rights obligations. Yes, that's what we need to do. And that's not like we haven't done it. It's been done
Yeah,
historically, and it's worked historically. And yes, we had our own disputes, but we're human like everybody else. I think having a dispute is an inherent right.
Well, yeah, adapting, right? But
You can't stop from getting angry once in a while.
but as part of the dispute structure and adapting this, since this whole government was designed as a colonial, their interests were priority. So now we dismantle Canada and we create a country on the foundation of treaty, their international law. So we have to change not only the Indigenous governance, but Canadian governance as well. And you've seen the Royal Commission had talked about an Aboriginal House of Governance in Parliament,
Yeah.
but they didn't want to change it because it was dealing with constitutional change. But you're saying it's time. I heard this word saying that the bundle of rights we have. I guess that's as Chief Willie Littlechild explains it. It's the bundle of rights from UNDRIP. We have the inherent rights. You have human rights. You have treaty rights. But what do we do now? What will bring this all together that will, put the tamiochamixiach. It's how do we make
Yeah.
good of this?
Well, you take each, like I was talking about. Let's take the citizenship membership sector. Why can't we have our own citizenship act of our nations? Principles will be the same. Most of the objectives will be the same. And there'll be some criteria that differentiate some differences of our nations. But not that many. But that's how you construct the act. And it recognizes all your inherent rights, your special status and your rights under your Citizenship Act. And through your membership code, you certify and register every Indian at birth. And then you recognize in your Citizenship Act the portability of your sovereignty, portability of your inherent rights and title, portability of your treaties and treaty rights. You see? Those are political instructions for drafting instructions for a Citizenship Act.
Yeah.
Just listing a few items. But you take the principles alone, that's a pretty major political instruction to every nation, every band, every chief and council on how to construct citizenship law. That's ours. And there's a failure, Rick, of our peoples to have to recognize our inherent legal system. We're so colonized
Yeah.
that we only think of the colonial legal system. We have an inherent legal system that applies and enforces our jurisdiction and laws of the governments of our nations. So that Citizenship Act that I just identified would be enforced under that process, under our own jurisdiction and laws. So now we have our own citizenship and membership, certified and registered by band and by nation. What's wrong with that? Nothing.
Yeah.
It's the simple act of doing it. Like I always said, do it, get it done. Now the other one we're disputing in the courts all the time about lands and resources. Well, isn't it about time we had our own inherent title to Lands and Resources Act that applies nationally, regionally, locally, not just on the reserve by band or by Métis community? You see? Where is our inherent title to Lands and Resources Act? Where's our Water Environmental Conservation Act? That's quite simple to get done, enforce and implement it. So those are things that we can do right now. And on the budgeting side, I told Privy Council about 4 years ago. That's the next most powerful office in Parliament, next to the Prime Minister's office. And Privy Council controls everything: finances, laws, uh, departments. It controls everything: lands, resources, and all that. So when I met with them, I said, look, it's time you implemented the same type of financing that you're providing for yourself. He said, what's that? Well, for 40 years now, you've been budgeting and financing your cost of your governments and your cost of living in the billions. That's for 40 years now. I said, and here we are still thinking around with nickels and dimes in the millions. But our needs are just as costly as yours are. Now, don't tell me you don't have the money, because you got the money to maintain your standard of living and finance your governments at every level. One federal government, 10 provincial governments, 2 territorial governments, 1 Nunavut government, and 4,000 urban and rural municipalities. Financing an acceptable level of funding for your living conditions. 100% of the money coming out of Parliament and provincial government. But we're going to go there. We have to go there, I said. And they agreed. They agreed we should be going there. But here we are, still thinking around with the millions, when they've been engaged not just in the billions, but coming close to the trillions now.
Yeah.
You see? So what's wrong with that? But why can't we sit down and develop our own Finance Administration Act that applies at every level? Now I laugh at that because I get some chiefs and councils saying, "Oh, we can't have the same Finance Administration Act." And what do I tell them? Well, you tell me what you're implementing now. Of course, they're implementing the Federal Finance Administration Act.
Yeah.
So 44 out of the 74 bands in FSIN are engaged in implementing the Federal Finance Administration Act, losing total jurisdiction to their fiscal relations and financing, never mind their capacity to budget. You see how simple it is when you ask the question you just asked?
Well,
What the
yeah,
hell's wrong with going from the Federal Finance Administration Act to our own First Nations Finance Administration Act by band, tribal council, FSIN, AFN, and so on? Nothing.
yeah,
Not a damn thing. But we formally occupy the field with our laws and jurisdiction and our powers of governing over fiscal relations and financing for the total membership, for transfers of funding from all those federal departments and agencies, Treasury Board and Finance, under the government to government fiscal agreements, like I talked about, that we done in 1972. And that's what they have between themselves. They have provincial, federal, fiscal, government to government fiscal agreements, don't they? Yeah, they have, you see. So why can't we have them? And they don't go with proposals and budgets annually from nothing to whatever they want for the new year, when those governments I'm talking about automatically have their previous budget identified for the new fiscal year, and they add whatever they need to that budget. But their fiscal year is not April to March. They add 3 extra months: May, June, and July. April, May, June, and July. They add that to their fiscal year. Why do they add the 3 months? That's to deal with their debt financing. See? And by the surpluses they have, to contribute to their debt financing if they can. And if they don't have the money, they go back to budgeting for new money to retire their debts. Now, what the hell's wrong with us
Yeah.
getting the same benefits? You see? So instead of that, they try to take the debt financing off the new funding for the new fiscal year for our people and our governments,
Wow.
when we're only getting 17% of the damn budget we need in the first place.
Yeah.
Those are serious issues, you see, that we're not dealing with. And the questions you just asked are asked all the time. I got a call this morning. One of the first questions was around what Crown Indian Nations relations is all about and how do we implement it. So I explained it. And his first question was, what do we do? he, he missed out the fact that those relationships are already recognized by that major comprehensive legal political framework. All those relationships that I just identified for you, they're already formally, politically, legally recognized. Well, what are we doing ourselves to implement them? You see, that's the question you're asking.
Yeah.
So what's wrong with implementing the national powers of governing?
Yeah.
Government says you only get the money if you implement their national powers of governing of external uh, national and international affairs. Well, they have nothing to say about that. It's already recognized by that framework I just talked about. So if they're going to provide that economic intimidation and the various SWAT strategies that they've been implementing all these years, what is SWAT? People would say. Well, SWAT is using special words and tactics to implement what they want and how they want it done on their terms.
Yeah.
And if you don't meet the terms that they use, they'll create new terms and try to replace terms that we used using their terms. You see, that's the SWAT strategy. And I've gone through it in 65 years many times. And now we're even starting to use it on ourselves.
No, that's yeah, that's the colonial strategy, I guess. That's what they were doing. But in terms of the colonial practices of the past, and then you see the modern day attempts of land and treaty right or inherent right recognition uh, on a provincial law called Saskatchewan First Act. Like
Yeah.
you look at the Alberta Sovereignty Act. To me, I thought that was affront to the inherent right and the access to lands because now the provincial policy is trying to define unoccupied crown land. Well,
Well, just the
as
title
you
is,
said, this Lands and Resources Act, I think we got to get going now
yeah.
because they're
Well,
going off
it's
and saying it's unoccupied. So,
when Treaty 6 was taken to the UN and they recognized Treaty 6 as an international treaty, they said, we're going to do something else. They said, we want to examine what the Crown and the British government did to violate Treaty 6.
okay.
So you know what they've done? They reviewed the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement of 1930 and they said it's invalid
Oh,
because it didn't have the consent of the Indian nations that they signed the international treaties with. So as far as the UN is concerned, the NRTA is invalid. Now, what does that do for the feds? That provides them with title to our lands and resources,
right,
and they can transfer that title to provinces.
right.
That's what they use to transfer the land and the resources administratively to provinces. And the title is still not touched, you see, but it remains our title. But in allowing them to implement the 1930 illegal document and agreement, what are we doing? Like that Saskatchewan Resource Act, That's illegal. The Sovereignty Act in Alberta is illegal. If they're going to apply their sovereignty, they better state how. Now, you see, that applies to us too.
Yeah,
What is our sovereignty? How do we enforce it and implement it? That's the kind of questions we got to answer.
that's right.
But to do that, you need the time like what you and I just took now to be able to have some in-depth discussions and get some mutual understandings about how and what we do for implementation enforcement. That's just not being done. And so then they try to deal with one issue at a time. As a
Well,
leader, I never took that tactic of having to deal with one issue at a time. Either you know your damn business of a leader or you shouldn't be a leader. So I walked straight forward with every issue, every portfolio, every every sector. Yes, I prioritized within the education sector itself, but I didn't prioritize education over health and over justice and so on.
right.
That's what our leaders are doing today
Yeah.
through the devolution process with the provinces and the feds. Well, what the hell are you going to achieve by doing that? Not very damn much, except to create a bigger mess, which is what's happening.
Well,
So I'm not saying, don't forget, Rick, I'm not saying that there's not a lot of good things being done and being implemented by our people, both Métis and Indian leaders and people. And there's a hell of a lot that's changed and being implemented. That yeah, it might not be exactly to the way Saul Sanderson wants it done, but the fact is it's being implemented with positive energy, not with negative energy. And you see, in reacting like we do all the time, that creates negative energy. And you can't achieve very damn much with negative energy. You need positive energy. And, and that's what we have to rebuild.
well, I think that a lot of that positive energy came from UNDRIP, as you mentioned, the United Nations and the work that they're doing really woke up, the colonial countries of the world. A lot of countries were created out of their colonial past and got their sovereignty back. But Canada,
Yeah.
the way we are now, we're in this treaty relationship, and one of the issues that has come about just recently, and I seen that you had made presentations on Bill C-53, the Métis
Yeah.
treaty making, or I'm not sure what what the document will do, but there has been some political moves by, I guess, the Saskatchewan Métis have pulled out of it. They still have Ontario and Alberta in there. But I always thought, the Métis with the treaty making process of the past, we were involved in treaty making right to Treaty 1, as I understood it, and
And Treaty
also in
3.
Treaty 3, but Treaty 9 as well, and Treaty
Yeah.
10 or Treaty
8.
11. But
Yeah.
why can't we be, adhesion to existing treaties? To me, I thought would strengthen the country as opposed to creating this self-government, watered down process that, we've been accustomed from our colonial brothers here.
Yeah. I don't know if you know, but I was one of the witnesses for the Métis on Bill C-53.
Right.
And it was being chaired by a member of cabinet,
Yeah.
from the federal government. And he said, "You got 5 minutes to do your presentation." And there's 5 or 6 of you on the panel, and they're going to have one question for each of you after you're done, he said. So I used my 5 minutes and I covered a lot of what I highlighted just a while ago.
Yeah.
I covered most of it in 5 minutes. And he should have saw his reaction. And I said, there was no such thing as a Métis here. I said, yeah, we had half breeds, but when you look at the term half breeds, that gives them inherent rights and benefits to all the First Nations, Indian nations, inherent rights, inherent sovereignty, inherent title. That's what they've inherited from their Indian side of being a half breed. But they've also inherited a lot of issues and rights from your side. I said, take an example. You claim title to lands and resources because you've occupied and used the lands and resources. You implemented a strategy here in Canada for your homesteads. I said, and what did the government do? The Liberal Party was in government, and they took a lot of those homesteads that were occupied by the settlers, and they didn't recognize their title to lands and resources. That's right in your colonial policies and your title to ownership. Instead, you canceled those and you gave them to your friends, your liberal friends. I said, when many of those families occupied those lands and improved them for years. I said, now the Métis have occupied and used land for years, for generations. So under their inherent sovereignty and their status of the heritage they have as English or Frenchmen now, I said, occupying as half breeds the lands and resources that they've occupied, they must have title already under your laws and policies. You saw the body language from that MP. So when I finished, he said, "Okay," he said, "you got 2 minutes left." He says. So I said, "I'm done." Okay, he said, "Each of you have one question." So he asked me a question. I answered it. And he asked me two more questions. I answered them. Then he got to the Inuit that was on the panel. He said, "I don't want you asking me any questions," he told the chairman, "because I want to ask Saul Sanderson a question." So she did, and I answered her. Then
Wow.
he went to the lawyer, for the Métis Nations lawyer, and asked him a question. So when the lawyer was answering it, he says, "Well, Saul, what do you think?" He says. That was my experience as a witness on the Métis Nations Bill C-53. And I said, it's a small start to recognizing Métis self-government, I said. But the court and the judge went a hell of a lot further than that, I said. He covered those political relations and issues I just presented to you for the recognition of Métis Nation and Métis government and Métis rights. That's what he announced recognition of. But you don't have them in your policy and the laws you're making here. They see he went on with that. He went on beyond that, and he recognized the Métis powers of treaty making. Well, they made treaties long before this. I said they were party to Treaty 1 and Treaty 3. I know of, and some were party to Treaty 10 and Treaty 8 and so on. So it's not like the Métis haven't made treaties. I said they just haven't enforced them, and you haven't recognized them. Why? I said, because that framework I already outlined to you, they already have treaty making powers. They already had capacity to make treaties. So that was my kind of information that I provided as a Métis Nations expert.
No, that was good. I got to see some of those presentations. I reviewed some of yours. I didn't see the questioning at the end, but that's a good story. That's
Yeah, so I said, "What? You're making treaties now with the First Nations in BC, and now you're mandating the Métis to make treaties while you're terminating ours. I want to know what you're doing."
no. Well, I guess the other experience I have up here is with forestry. Living in the bush, We see forest companies develop, but a group of our Métis communities got together with a forest lease agreement up here, and the provincial government, came to us and told them use it or lose it. If they didn't have a forestry plan to cut it, or there's no such thing as conservation and planning. It was so this use it or lose it kind of echoes in my mind when you talk about these rights. And if we don't practice, if we don't exercise our responsibilities and rights, we could lose them. So I think the message you're giving us today, Saul, is we have to get to work. We have to get together, and doing it together is stronger. It's a treaty making process amongst ourselves. That we got to have dispute resolution systems in those treaties, because when it comes to land allocation, you don't want communities fighting over land, land and resources amongst ourselves. I think you know, what would you say in closing? I guess you started this when you were 15 years old, but in
Yeah.
closing today, what would you tell that 15-year-old Saul today now to be mindful of in 2024?
I would, I would tell them this much the same advice I got at 15 years old. Know their history, know your history, and you'll make plans that they can build on, not make plans that create barriers for them. That's why you're a leader. And you need to have an open door policy as a leader. You cannot have a closed door policy where you're selective in who you meet and who you want to talk to. You're a leader. Your door has to be open to everybody. So we had an FSI office in Central Avenue in PA, and many of the people that were called River Street people that were down and out, and they had addiction problems. We didn't close our door to them. It was open for them to come and discuss what they needed and what had to be done to help them. But today we have our own people being shut out by our own people, and it's just not acceptable. So there's much that the young leaders have to know, and it'll take time for them to learn, but they have to be willing to learn it. And you got to stay positive. You can't get anything done with negative energy. And that's in everything you do, even in family, your community, your government, your nation. And we have enough negative energy going around with adding to it. You know? But again, those are those symptoms I'm talking about, eh?
Yeah.
Look at the impact of residential schools, parenting skills being lost big time. And many of our elders are still angry from those experiences. And so there's lots that we need to do in terms of our own healing, and we can do it. I laughed at the PA gathering of nations. I was in a group with senators from Prince Albert Grand Council and ours, and some of the chiefs were in there. And they got into discussing the drugs and alcohol issue. How do we deal with it? Red Earth said, we made bylaws to limit any alcohol or drugs being used on the reserve. I said, and they said the police won't enforce them. They're not being enforced. I said, well, I had that problem at home in 72 when I was chief. But I said I was a former policeman for 5.5 years, knowing how to apply law and enforce jurisdiction. The issue you're talking about, if I was policing at Red Earth today, I would have no laws or jurisdiction to enforce. But it's not easy to enforce a bylaw. you need to make a law. So what I did at home to deal with the bootleggers and the selling of drugs and alcohol, I made a law that anybody conducting business on the reserve and the band had to have a permit from the band office to do any business on the reserve. Without that permit, your business is illegal. So when the druggies came along to peddle their drugs and stuff like that, their liquor, the police, the RCMP had a mandate and authority to deal with it. I said, even their homes, not just their vehicle. And our law will apply so that if you have to, you can seize their vehicle or seize some of their assets. But no more. I said, no more selling of drugs or alcohol on this reserve unless they have a permit. So who's going to come to you for a permit? Not too many would be brave enough to come to get a permit like that. But if they didn't have it, they couldn't do business on the reserve. You see? So I can tell you that cut down a hell of a lot of illegal drugs and alcohol being sold on that reserve. Changed after I left because the law wasn't enforced.
Yeah, the enforcement is the
But you
big
see, you
challenge.
can't, as a policeman, you can't enforce jurisdiction and laws if you don't have any laws to enforce. So that's just one simple method that you can do to stop your drugs and alcohol from being provided on reserves, besides enforcing the treaty right. No alcohol under treaty. Not just on reserve, but no alcohol, period, for Indians. Violating our own treaty. Much to be thinking about and much to do. So Doug Cardinal done a project in Venice, Italy, with some Indigenous architects from the world. They done the Canadian Pavilion there, and part of that Canadian Pavilion, they done a documentary on me, and they called it 500 Years with Saul.
Oh,
and a lot of it identified what I just talked about
yeah.
in that documentary. And Elsie and I happened to be sitting there when some people came in the door, and that video was showing on the screen. And they look at the screen and look back at me, look at the screen, look back at me. Finally, they came over. They said, "Is that you, Saul Sanderson?" I said, "Yeah, that's me." So that pavilion now is, there was 52 countries participating in that process. So they kept it there for a few months. Then they moved it back to Ottawa at the Museum of Man. And then they were moving it out west. And when it ended up in Vancouver, it was going to be touring through the US. And after it was done in the US, every one of those countries want that pavilion to be seen in their own countries.
Wow.
So 500 Years with Saul Sanderson will be all over the place. And Doug Cardinal says, "And Saul, you can't die," he said. And at Edmonton, one of the assemblies, done my presentation. And when they sat down, and I just sat down beside Elsie and others, and these elderly ladies, a couple of them came running up. They said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, Saul." They said, "Now you can't die."
Well, I guess in
But
closing, I just wanted to pose a question, or I guess a thought on your mind here. The politics, as you said, the political agenda is going to be, the big arena here. But federal politics, provincial politics means people have to vote. And a lot of times people have this confusion or misinterpretation or a myth, or I'm not sure if it's well founded, but by engaging in the politics of parliament or the legislatures, that we're diminishing our sovereignty. Uh, uh, and then you lose the political clout or the political, I guess, correcting of the political leaders you have. They're not representing you if you don't have a say in it. So we have, you see the Churchill River, Mississippi, Desnette, the new boundaries are further north now. They use the NAD
Yeah.
line. They've cut off Meadow Lake. But through those elections, in my experience, some people won't take part because they feel like they're contributing to the colonial engagement of our country. But what do you see in these federal politics, provincial politics, that our Indigenous people have to take part, be involved? And I know you've engaged in this, but just your thoughts on going forward. What's your message for the political engagement of our people?
Well, in getting engaged politically, you ask for my advice and my opinion. You can only get involved in the federal politics or provincial politics if you're a liberal. That issue has been a sensitive one for years by our people, eh? When
Yes,
they first accepted the vote, there was a big debate about what you just talked about, compromising our sovereignty of the governments of our nations by
yes.
voting for another government of the nation. But now Section 35.2 does what? It creates dual citizenship status for Rick Laliberty and for Saul Sanderson. And that means you can participate in voting in either government. You have dual citizenship status under the Section 35.2. That gives you some comfort.
Uh, that's the best explanation I've ever received, Saul. I think that's a perfect example of the knowledge that you presented today. A lot
Yeah.
of it is, like you said, it's a silent. It's been hidden, it's been covered. You're
Yeah.
unraveling some of this knowledge that our people need to be aware of. And I thank you for sharing today. It's
Yes, you're welcome. Yeah.